Dr. Mark Chang, easy here at your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about far left versus far right. Now, we've talked about left and right before. We've talked about how the Nolan diagram, where you have personal liberty and economic liberty, and as a rough and ready kind of a first order approximation, you can kind of get at left right by saying that the left is more open to personal freedom and less open to economic freedom, and vice versa. And this gives you the typical socialism versus capitalism kind of thing that drives a lot of the debate in a lot of the countries. But of course, there's many other dimensions beyond that. And of course, after COVID, something, an earlier Science Moment video from a long time ago, a lot of that seems to have changed in terms of COVID. Really, it became about authoritarianism down below and sort of freedom on both dimensions above. But I wanted to talk today because after October 7th, it really revealed a kind of similarity with the far left and the far right. Again, left and right are not ill in the ways that I'm going to describe, but when you end up with a certain kind of exaggerations of the dimensions that I'm going to talk about that lead to left and right, there's a sense in which they come back and meet, but not the horseshoe theory, at all. They end up agreeing on certain kinds of issues for very fundamentally different kinds of reasons, but can nevertheless come to agreement about certain kinds of things. But it doesn't mean that they're the same as the horseshoe theory might potentially. Horseshoe theory being that eventually these things, it's a loop and far left just becomes far right. No, that's not the case at all. So I want to walk through a Loose Wired magazine piece that I had written a little while ago and just sort of walk through it with you in this guise. And the idea is that we're giving a broader, more general explanation for what it is that we're meaning when we say left and when we say right, and what are the underlying psychological principles in some sense, or the principles that drive that kind of viewpoint, right? So I think it occurred to me after October 7th, the massacre, and watching the far left, the progressive left, and the far, I call it the pandemic conspiracy right, suddenly became anti-Semitic, and for very different reasons. And I've talked about this before. The far left, sort of by end of day, October 7th, blamed Israel because 75 years of blah, 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 whereas the far right blamed Israel and because they're the ones who did a psyop and there really wasn't a massacre at all, or if there was, they're the ones behind the massacre after all, right? So these guys, so you're starting to ask yourself, okay, this is interesting. Why is it the case that you end up with far left and far right behaving in these ways? And is there a nice single-dimensional way of thinking about it such that in the limit of these really far cases, it captures that difference, right? That's the idea. We don't want to, the whole point of explanations is to get it down to a small number of dimensions so that it's simple. So this is a kind of, again, a first order or zeroth order way of thinking about left and right, such that it also explains far left and far right, right? All right, so let me just walk through it here. The title of this, The Far Left and Far Right Are Both Conspiracy Theory Driven, but are opposites. So what do I mean by that? The far left are what I call God followers. And I'll explain what I mean. Obviously, the stereotype of the left is that they're not at all, sort of religious compared to the right. But that's not what I mean here. The far left tends to believe great goodness in the world is only due to the actions of a centralized cabal. And I'm calling it the God cabal. And it's that God cabal that intentionally pushes goodness on the world through smart, top-down policies and interventions. In the absence of these policies by the God cabal, the world would mostly be bad. Right? The world is mostly bad, and because of this cabal, this God cabal of goodness, these good intentions and these good policies, etc., it can spread goodness throughout the world. That's kind of a general viewpoint. People are generally bad, but the really smart experts and great folks that want to organize top-down can make it potentially good. So free markets and free expression, each which works via decentralized mechanisms, are bad. Because that's just leaving it up to the people, all right? It's leaving it up to the people, and they're generally bad. And any good coming from them is due to the policies of the God cabal. So when there is good that comes out of free markets and free expression, and of course there's, mountains of good, it always has to be explained not from the decentralized processes. It ultimately has to be explained due to the God cabal. Now, of course, short amount left and short amount right. The short amount left will say, yeah, it works better when there's a little bit of government controls to make sure there's not this or not that bad thing. But again, the very far left will have some of the more extreme versions that I'm saying, just to keep the starkness clear. So for COVID, what did this mean for COVID? For COVID, for the left, the far left, for COVID, the good that occurred was due to their interventions, right? Only the interventions could explain goodness that came out of the perceived pandemic. Individual actions like they relied upon in Sweden couldn't possibly lead to goodness. It could only be explained by centralized, top-down COVID interventions. Right? That's why they had that kind of viewpoint. They're prone to that kind of viewpoint. Now, how about conflicts between strong and weak? In conflicts between strong and weak, while the world is by and large bad, outside of the God cabal, the least bad amongst all of those are those who are weak, with the least agency. These are the victims that the far left tends to side with. Right? So everybody's pretty much bad out there, away from the God cabal. But the least bad are those that have no agency at all. So if they have no agency, they can't do stuff that makes things even worse, right? So in the case of 9/11, well, the weak were the Islamists. And so the US must have deserved it, right? And for October 10, again, the weak were again the same Islamic folks, Islamist folks, the same Islamofascists. And so, again, Israel deserved it. The far left, again, converged to the viewpoint of September 11th and October 7th, in a very similar viewpoint, that the West, the big power in the West, the United States or Israel, deserved it because 75 years, because something along those lines. Sided with the victims as the least agency filled and thus least evil, least bad once you're away from the God cabal. So again, and what's nice is, as you see, I'm going to talk about the far right, which is based upon a similar kind of conspiracy theory, but it's going to be the opposite. So again, conspiracy theory here is that goodness always comes from a cabal, the God cabal. Now, for the right, I'm going to talk about them as demon battlers, is another way to think about it. Rather than God followers, they're demon battlers. The far right, on the other hand, tends to believe that great badness in the world is only due to the actions of a centralized cabal, the demon cabal, intentionally pushing evil on the world through sophisticated top-down subversive manipulation. In the absence of these evil influences, the world would mostly be good. Right? So, totally opposite viewpoint, but the same in another sense. Like, people are generally good, and when there's badness, it's to be blamed on the evil demon cabal. Whereas the opposite was a similar kind of conspiracy theory, but it's not usually what we think of it as a conspiracy theory. Usually we think of conspiracy theories as an evil cabal, but it's just as much a conspiracy theory to believe that the goodness in the world comes from the good cabal. It's only through centralized government, socialism, blah, 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 that we have all the good things that we have, which is exactly how the far left thinks, right? But you have this opposite kind of polarity where you see the world in very similar ways. You just have to flip evil and good, or flip good and bad in the ways that I'm talking about. So, truly free markets and free expression, each which works via decentralized mechanisms, are good, unlike it was for the God cabal. That's good, because it's just people behaving, and people are generally good when they behave on their own, with their own agency. It tends to be good, all things equal, and any bad coming from them is due to the manipulations of the demon cabal, and which does happen a lot in their view. The further right you get, the more they often believe that the badnesses in capitalism and so forth are due to these bad cabals that are manipulating and puppeteering here, and it's big tech and blah, 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 and everything is and there really is no free market at all. Effectively, it's all being controlled by the mustache twiddlers when you get to the far enough right. And they often become effectively anti-free markets at the very far right because of that. All right, so, but nevertheless, you get this typical socialism versus decentralized free markets on this notion of left and right, these two different opposing notions of what a conspiracy theory even means. But as you go farther right, you also can explain why the very, very far right tends to actually be anti-free market, because they tend to think that its ills, which there are always ills, are due to these cabals and manipulating everything. All right, so that's the free market versus socialism, which is the standard thing that we think of left and right. But we want to be able to see if we can explain what happened in COVID and also sort of September 11th and October 7th. Well, for COVID, the bad that occurred was because the demon cabal engineered the whole thing. Right? This is for the far right again. The bad that occurred was because of the demon cabal. These are the plandemic sorts. These are the folks that thought for 20 years there's been a plan to create a perceived pandemic, to install chips in us, to reset the economy, to have a depopulation, all of these different kinds of things. It was all a plan by the demon cabal to do that. Not just the interventions, but the emergency itself, the virus, if there even are viruses, of course. These folks are much more likely to believe that even viruses, the very notion of a virus, is a psyop, right? And it was engineered so as to do a great reset, put chips in us, depopulate, etc. Now, in conflicts between strong and weak, while the world is by and large good to the demon cabal folks, to the demon battlers, that's how they view themselves, rather than God followers. In conflicts between strong and weak, while the world is by and large good, the least good are those who are strong with the most agency. These are the oppressors that are enjoined with or being manipulated by the demon cabal. For 9/11, the strong was the United States, which itself, controlled by the demon cabal, brought the towers down. Islamists didn't do it. It was the demon cabal in conjunction with the United States or some kind of conspiracy to bring the towers down and blame it on Islamists. And for October 7, the strong was Israel, which itself massacred Israeli civilians, if the civilians were massacred at all, right? And it was under the influence, again, of the demon cabal. So again, just to summarize, point here is that you can characterize left and right on the basis of the general viewpoint they have within the world. The left views the world as generally bad, and any good coming from it tends to be better explained by a centralized goodness which spreads it top down. Whereas the right is quite the opposite. People, generally speaking, generally are good, and when things are bad, it's because of some centralized, but often some cabal that's making things bad. And that nice thing about that explanation is it captures the typical left-right economic personal liberty stuff, but it also captures COVID, and it also captures the kinds of beliefs that the far left and the far right have for cases of massacres like 9/11 and October 7. And that was your science moment. If you haven't gotten a copy of Tim Barber and my book, Expressly Human, on the origins of emotional expressions, get a copy today.